Still with us to talk about this case, Dr. Tracy A. Pearson and Dave Ehrenberg, both attorneys. Tracy, let me start with you first. This is really a convoluted, complicated case in terms of all the different experts testifying about the amount of painkillers given to patients versus the amount that this doctor allegedly gave to them, the type of painkillers used. How hard is it, in your opinion, for a jury to really absorb that much information about all the medical intricacies?
I think jurors are very smart. And when they're committed to their jury service, it becomes very interesting if presented well. And in watching this trial, it seems as if the information is in fact being presented well. I thought what that witness talked about was very interesting, in that it seemed to suggest that there was a deliberate nature in the way that that the requests were being made. In other words, it wasn't one nurse that was requesting all of these medications. It was all of the nurses, that they seemed to all line up without a blip on the screen to alert them, almost to suggest that there was a pre-plan, or that the person who was requesting, the doctor, the defendant, was being deliberately careful about not triggering that system.
Dave, it's really a frightening case for anyone who's in the hospital. The allegations in this case, that is, there were 25 cases initially being prosecuted, but then 11 of those were dismissed at the request of the prosecution. We know there are now 14 murder counts. What are your thoughts about the facts of this case?
I'm very familiar with this type of case. We prosecuted a guy named Dr. Barry Schultz for something somewhat similar, for being a walking pill mill, and we got him more than 150 years in prison. And this is similar because you have a guy who prescribed amounts of fentanyl that were way beyond any legitimate prescription should be. You know, doctors get a lot of discretion in cases like this. Doctors can use their knowledge to prescribe medication to their patients. But when it comes to the amounts that this doctor prescribed and delivered, it was so overboard, so beyond the pale, that he's being charged with 14 counts of murder. That could have been 25 counts. But the fact is, 14 murders, and this guy, I hope, I assume he will not take the stand, but in this unprecedented opioid epidemic, it is frustrating to me that so few people have been held accountable with a pair of handcuffs. No Purdue Pharma executive who created this opioid epidemic, and very few doctors, and maybe he's the next one and should be.
And what about the fact that, you know, he is saying it was comfort care to prevent suffering? That's the reason I was doing it. Is that a defense, Tracy, that you think could prevail? And how do you know, where's that line between comfort care versus overdosing, killing, murdering?
Just like in the case that we saw before, this case is boiled down to standard of care. There's a standard of care that doctors follow, and that's the line. And so if he has stepped over the line, that indicates that there's wrongdoing here. The question is, was it reckless behavior or was it deliberate behavior?
Dave, I have to go back to the case that you mentioned that you successfully prosecuted there in Florida. Was there a motive that was identified or argued in that case? Because there hasn't been one mentioned in this case. I don't think that the prosecution intends to argue a motive. We know that's not an element, but of course juries like to know the why.
Yes, that's a great point, Judge Ashley. I think in our case, it was easier to prove because the motive was greed. He was a pill mill. He was a drug dealer wearing a white coat. Here, you don't have the motive of greed, or that he was a Dr. Kevorkian who just exulted in causing death. You just had a guy who went way beyond his standard of care for whatever reason and prescribed massive amounts of fentanyl. And fentanyl is the new face of the opioid epidemic. The opioid epidemic used to be about Oxycontin, and then it morphed to oxycodone, then it morphed to heroin. Now it's fentanyl, and fentanyl is 50 times more powerful than heroin. So you can understand when he's prescribing these amounts, it could kill 25 people, and prosecutors are only going to charge the cases that they know they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt, which is why they limited it to 14 people, but it's still 14 people too many.
And Dave, I always appreciate your expertise, but in particular, thank you for your passion around this and your knowledge and the prosecutions you've been successful in. Of course, Tracy A. Pearson, Dave Ehrenberg, thank you for being with us today and your legal expertise. I also want to thank all of you at home for joining us. This is it for me. Don't go anywhere. Michael Ayala is in the anchor chair up next.
Power outages are unpredictable.